continuing our studies in the book of Revelation. And this week we'll be covering chapters 4 to 14, and this is for St. Matthew Parish in Glendale Heights. And to review for ourselves, the book of Revelation, remember, and it is called the book of Revelation, not Revelations. And it comes from that Greek term apocalypsis, which is to reveal. So it's about something that is hidden that is being revealed. And the literary form for this book, which you know from having done the homework questions, is that it is a prophetic writing. And so we have already examined the first 3 chapters in which John indicates that he is getting this prophetic message from God through Jesus to an angel and then to him to pass on to these 7 churches. So this is quite a handoff happening here. But prophetic in the sense that it doesn't mean that it's predicting the future and specific events per se, because that's not what prophecy is, but rather it's speaking to God's messages to us. So we see in apocalyptic writing, and it was a very popular genre, messages from God to us about him and about the way we should live. Important things for us, certainly. So this book, which is prophetic, that has messages for us, that was given to John, he was, of course, he tells us in the book, in the first 3 chapters, that he is on an island in Patmos, that he's been placed there, and apparently has been suffering persecution, just as some of these 7 churches have been suffering as well. So our setting for this is John, he is in worship. While he is in worship, he has this vision of God, and he comes to understand in his higher sensibility that God is communicating something to him. So he has this vision while he's in worship on a Sunday in a liturgy of this message to these 7 churches that he needs to send to them. And he understands what they're going through because they're living in an era, most scholars put this book at a time frame of the Emperor Domitian, who was nearing the end of the very first century. And of course, he had persecuted people that were followers of Christ. And so these churches, because of the fact that they were unable to offer the emperor worship as a deity, found themselves in trouble. They would be cut off virtually from being able to do economic business because of the fact that they couldn't offer sacrifices that way first. So those were part and parcel of the patriotic duty of every Roman citizen. And they would have found themselves unable to do this. So he, in worship, is sending them these letters and greetings from their guardian angels. And of course, the island of Patmos is not too far from them, because it is an island about 50, 60 miles off the coast of Turkey, which is where these churches are located. And you, of course, took a look at what was in the letters to the 7 churches in these different communities. And some of them were commended. They weren't being reproached at all, but others were having some difficulties. And if you had to really say to yourself, which church seemed to have the biggest of the problems, did anybody figure out a church that did? The biggest of the problems. He basically tells them, your faith is dead. Sardis. That's exactly right. So whatever issues you may have in your own parish, at least you're not dead. So, because he tells them there's nothing to commend that community. There is no praise in that letter. And so that's a rough situation if you're in a faith community like that. So it's going to take a lot to bring those people back. And then, of course, Ephesus, which is right along the coast, very big commercial port city and center, big temples there and so forth. They were hard workers, but they had lost the love they first had. And so he tells them, look, if you recommit to God, that you will have a reward by eating from the tree of life. And the tree of life is one of those very big important symbols that not only is found in the book of Genesis in the creation story. There's 2 trees in the garden, remember. There is the tree of knowledge, but there's also the tree of life. And of course, the tree of life is what gives you immortality. So when he's telling them they will be able to eat from the tree of life, of course, he's telling them they will be promised eternal life here. That tree becomes very important also in the wisdom literature, because we will read, when you study with us in year 4, when we begin to look at the wisdom literature, we're going to look at that image as it resurfaces within the wisdom literature again. So that's what's happening with them. Now the community that is in Smyrna, they, of course, they were suffering. They weren't really reproached, but they were suffering. And of course he knew what that was because he was living in an exile. And he tells them that if they persevere, they will not be harmed and will not suffer the second death. And of course, if the first death is your physical death, what do you suppose the second death might be? A spiritual death, a damnation. That's right. So a second death would be where your eternal life is at risk here, that you might suffer damnation here. And of course, some of these other communities might have had some people that were stirring up the waters or bringing in false ideas. So in a parish community where that's happening, an example of that might be Pergamum, where they had other teachers, and they list Balaam and the Nicolaitans. And so those were apparently people, we don't really know what they taught, but apparently it was something that John saw as contrary to what was the teachings of Christ. So Thyatira tolerated a troublemaker, and so bad was this person that John calls whoever it is a Jezebel. And if you remember from year 1, Jezebel, remember she was King Ahab's wife. And she was the one that went after the prophet Elijah. And they had tried to buy that vineyard. And then when Naboth wouldn't sell them the vineyard, they ended up having him killed for it. And Elijah went after them for this because that's certainly unacceptable. And so Jezebel, of course, he doesn't mind going head to head with her. And she ends up tumbling out of the window of her palace, remember, and the dogs drag her away. So this is not a pleasant fate, certainly, for her. And so anyway, someone like this Jezebel person was apparently in that community in Thyatira. But poor Sardis, they were a dead community, and he was really probably trying to figure out, what can I say to you to wake you up here? Philadelphia was a good community, and remember, our city of Philadelphia is named for that Philadelphia. So they had kept the word of Jesus, and they hadn't denied him. So they were commended for this. And then there was no praise for one other city, and that was, of course, Laodicea. And they had become lukewarm in their faith. And of course, we see this can happen usually when there's something to replace your faith. You start to become tepid in the faith, and you put your direction elsewhere. And what was it they were lukewarm about? What did they have?
Riches.
They had money. That's right. Their wealth. And that can so easily happen to a person, where after a while it becomes important to you, then it becomes your sole pursuit. And then what will suffer from that, of course, would be likely to be your faith. And that's exactly what happened to the community of Laodicea. So, any questions about those communities there? Were you all able, by the way, to find one of these communities that was similar to your own faith community? I don't want you to name your faith community and which of these communities they were most like. But one of our questions, of course, asked you to think about that. Did any of this resonate for your own faith community? Because that's certainly timeless. We suffer these same kinds of things even in our own faith communities today. Yes?
How did John, if it was John,
Right.
know about all these different communities? And was he isolated on an island? Then how did he get information to and from? They allowed information to come?
Well, we're
letters?
pretty much speculating here, but I would be willing to bet, it's a safe bet, that he was from those communities. And remember, they were all connected by a Roman road. These 7 communities were. So it very likely they were well aware of each other and knew each other and so forth, because they all were in the same region in Asia Minor. So I would say it's a safe bet. If he was in exile on the island of Patmos, it's right off the coast of Turkey. It would make sense if they're going to exile him to an island that it would be near where he was. Not swimmable, but certainly close enough that he could send a communication. And depending upon, of course, who it was that had someone imprisoned or what the reason was for the imprisonment, they certainly could have visitors. Communications could be sent back and forth. Remember Paul, of course, there were people that were sent to take care of you while you were in prison. Because if they didn't bring you food and things like that, remember, you starved. So we saw the very same thing with Philemon.